Here's Chapter 8 of Harriet the Spy by Louisa Fitzhugh. When Harriet started her spy route the next day, she decided to visit the Robinsons first, because the day before she had seen an immense crate delivered to their house, and she couldn't wait to see what was in it. The Robinsons were always moody right before they bought something. And this time they had been moody for a week, so she figured this must have been a whopper of a purchase. She sneaked up to the window. There was the crate. It sat squarely in the middle of the living room. How did they get it in? She thought. And then she saw that it would go through the door with just about an inch to spare all around. Mrs. Robinson was running around it in ecstasy. Mr. Robinson was hopping up and down on one foot. A railway expressman was starting to unpack the crate. "A crowning achievement," said Mr. Robinson. "A joy, such a joy," said Mrs. Robinson, completing a circle. "Wait till, just think what they'll..." They were so excited that they didn't bother to make sentences. The railway expressman ignored them. He worked steadily and noisily until the front section was worked ready to be pulled away. Harriet held her breath. The front panel came away, exposing nothing but sawdust. "Well," thought Harriet, "that does it." But then the sawdust was being pulled frantically away by Mr. and Mrs. Robinson, who had leaped forward in their eagerness, pushing aside the railway expressman. "There, there!" screamed Mrs. Robinson. And there, indeed, was the strangest thing Harriet had ever seen. It was an enormous, perhaps 6 feet high, wooden sculpture of a fat, petulant, rather unattractive baby. The baby wore a baby cap, huge white dress, and baby booties. The head was completely round and carved out of butcher's block, so that it resembled a beautifully grained newel post with a face carved in it. The baby sat on its diapered bottom, feet straight out ahead, and fat arms curving into fatter hands, which held, surprisingly, a tiny mother. Harriet stared. Mrs. Robinson exclaimed with her hand to her heart, "She is a genius." This was too much even for the railway expressman, who could contain himself no longer, and said, "Who?" rather rudely. "Why, this sculptor. She is marvelous. She's brilliant. She is a white star in the firmament." "Yeah? A dame made that?" He gaped. "If you've finished..." Mr. Robinson looked pompous. "Oh, yeah. I just have to carry out the junk. Where do you want her? It? Darling, I still think the corner behind the entrance so that it isn't seen immediately. You know, and then it will dominate the room from the couch." "It'll do that, all right," said the railway expressman, picking up his excelsior in handfuls and stuffing it into the crate. "Just be kind enough to remove this without comment," said Mr. Robinson huffily. The baby was rolled into a corner, and the crate removed by the grinning workman. Harriet left Mr. and Mrs. Robinson holding hands and gazing at it in speechless joy. She went to the street and wrote in her book, "Old Golly is right. There's as many ways to live as possible," she says, "but wait till she hears about this 1,000-pound baby. Oh, I forgot. She paused and looked into space. When somebody goes away, there's things you want to tell them. When somebody dies, maybe that's the worst thing. You want to tell them things that happen after old golly isn't dead. She slammed the book shut, feeling something akin to rage, and then she got up and headed over to the DeSanti family. Nothing much was happening in the front of the store, so she crept around to the back to watch little Joe curry. He was in full command of an array of food that would have fed the Marines for a week. He munched happily. Harriet was wondering if the kids had been there yet, when suddenly the phone rang inside the store. Little Joe looked guilty and started to hide things just in case, when there was a blood-curdling scream from the front of the store. Little Joe was so startled, a piece of bread fell right out of his mouth. Harriet dashed around to the front. Mrs. DeSanti was being held by Bruno in a half-faint, through which she managed to scream as loud as a dying opera singer, "Echo, echo! He is killed! All is lost! Dio, Dio!" "No, Mama, just an accident." Bruno began looking helplessly to Papa DeSanti, who was hanging up the phone. "Dead, killed, truck smashed to bits, eccola, Dio, Dio, mi figlio," and she swooned. Bruno looked as though he might drop the considerable weight, so Papa DeSanti rushed to help him. As he did so, he said, "Mama, Mama, the truck is not smashed. Fabio is not smashed. Nothing is smashed, but his head when he gets here. A fender, that's all it was, a fender." Signora DeSanti revived immediately and started to run up and down the store, waving her arms wildly and screaming in Italian. The customers stood around like frozen food. She ran up and down, finally gathering so much momentum that she crashed on into the storeroom, there discovering little Joe with a whole cucumber in his mouth. "Ecco! Not bad enough stealing us blind!" And gathering up all the food in one arm and little Joe by the ear, she came catapulting back into the store. The family stared open-mouthed. The customers came alive and started to edge towards the door, feeling that this was perhaps too much. "Mama, Mama, ti calma!" Papa DeSanti, seeing the evidence of little Joe's treachery, began to scream himself, a long string of frightening-sounding words. "But Papa!" Bruno screamed to be heard. "Where is Fabio? Is he hurt? Is he in the hospital?" Him? He is fine. Evidentemente. What could happen to him? It's the truck. The truck is smashed." Papa DeSanti managed to get this out, then went back to screaming at little Joe. "Fired! You're fired! We are not running a restaurant." Suddenly, the front door tinkled, then slammed, and there was utter silence as they all turned to see Fabio standing there. He had a minuscule patch of plaster on his forehead. "My son!" screamed Mama DeSanti, and rushed towards him. "You're hurt! He's hurt, Papa! Look, he's hurt!" And she flung herself at him with such force that Fabio was hurled back against the door. "It's nothing, Mama," he said, smiling. She straightened up, looked at him hard for 1 minute, and then slapped him across the head. "Your father worked with his bare hands for that truck. Work hard, not like you. Work hard, understand?" The family watched this in awe, as did Harriet. Fabio turned red and tears sprang to his eyes. "Mama," he began. Don't mamma me. You no son of mine. No son of mine. She raised one finger aloft to the ceiling. From this day forward. Mama, Papa DeSanti interrupted. Don't yet. Let's see what the boy has to say. Harriet felt wildly curious. Fabio shot a grateful glance at his father. He looked terribly embarrassed. He fidgeted in his pockets until he found an old bent cigarette, which he put in his mouth. It hung there broken. Maybe, thought Harriet, he can't talk without that. The whole family was looking at him. He bent his head, apologetically, and then began in a low voice. I didn't want to tell you till later. Papa. He looked up at his father in a very sad way. I can't help it. I just don't want to be in the grocery business. It's not your fault. It's just to be stuck in a store all day. It's not for me. So He took a deep breath. I took another job. You what? Papa and Mama DeSanti said in one breath. I took another job. The only thing is, you need a car for this job. I'm a salesman. He looked frightened, Harriet thought. Well. Papa DeSanti looked totally amazed. Then an enormous, broad grin spread over his face. Son? You're working? Mama DeSanti looked as though she might faint again. Yes, Mama. And looking at his father, he laughed. I am working. Santa Maria, Mama DeSanti fainted. Bruno caught her. Papa DeSanti uttered all sorts of exclamations and slapped Fabio rather hard, Harriet thought, on the back. The others gathered around, with the exception of little Joe, who took this opportunity to filch a piece of gorgonzola. Harriet tiptoed to the street and there sat down to write in her book. My, better than a movie. It's such a happy ending, I don't believe it for 1 minute. I bet that Fabio is up to no good as usual. Wait, he didn't say what he was a salesman for. I wonder what he's selling. I must come back tomorrow to see what happens to little Joe Curry. Harriet went over to Harrison Withers. She looked through the skylight. Harrison Withers sat at his work table, but he wasn't working. He was looking out the window. His face was the saddest face Harriet had ever seen. She stared at him a long time, but he didn't move a muscle. She went across to the other skylight, and there she saw such a strange sight that she almost keeled over. What she saw was an empty room. Not a cat in sight. She ran back to Harrison Withers to see if she had perhaps missed seeing the cats. No, nor were they in the kitchen. She sat back on her heels. They got him, she thought. They finally got him. She leaned over once more to look at his face. She looked for a long time, and then she sat down and wrote in her book. I will never forget that face as long as I live. Does everybody look that way when they've lost something? I don't mean like losing a flashlight. I mean, do people look like that when they have lost? That's the end of chapter 8. That one was a short chapter. So maybe something you can do is think about what happened to those cats. Maybe it was the animal control that came to take them, like the way that she thought they would before, because they kept coming to his house. But maybe something else happened. So you can think of something that happened that would be really interesting, that explains where those cats are. They had to go somewhere. I'll go ahead and read some of chapter 9, since chapter 8 was so short. Chapter 9. Harriet felt so grumpy that she knocked off work for the day. That night, after supper, she tried to practice being an onion. She started by falling down several times, making a great bumping noise each time. The idea was to fall in a rolling way, the way that an onion would, and then roll around in a complete circle several times. Then roll slowly to a stop, the way that an onion would if you put it down on a table. Harriet rolled around and bumped into a chair, knocking it over. Her mother came to the door. She looked down at Harriet lying there with the chair on top of her. "What are you doing?" she asked mildly. "Being an onion." Her mother picked up the chair off of Harriet's chest. Harriet didn't move. She was tired. "What in all the world is all that noise I hear in here?" "I told you, I'm being an onion." "It's a pretty noisy onion." "I can't help it. I can't do it right yet. Miss Barry says that when I do it right, I won't make a sound." "Oh, it's for the Christmas pageant. Is that it?" "Well, you don't think I just be an onion all on my own, do you?" "None of your lip there, girl. Get up and let me see what you have to do." So Harriet got up and fell over and then rolled and rolled until suddenly she rolled right under the bed. She came out full of dust mice. Mrs. Welsh looked horrified. "That terrible maid. I'm going to fire her tomorrow." She looked at Harriet, who stood ready to fall again. "That's the clumsiest dance I ever saw. Miss Barry assigned this?" "Miss Barry assigned the onion part. I'm making up the dance," Harriet said pointedly. "Oh," said Mrs. Welsh discreetly. Harriet fell over again, this time rolling away almost into the bathroom. Mr. Welsh came into the room. "What's going on in here? It sounds like someone hitting a punching bag." "She's being an onion." They stood watching Harriet fall over and over again. Mr. Welsh put his pipe in his mouth and crossed his arms. According to Stanislavski, you have to feel like an onion. Do you feel like an onion? Here's some illustrations of Harriet practicing being an onion, and it looks like she's probably in her pajamas. So that's the dance that she's doing to be an onion. So the dad was asking, "Do you feel like an onion?" "Not in the least," said Harriet. "Oh, come on. What are they teaching you in school these days?" Mrs. Welsh started to laugh. "No, I'm serious. There's a whole school downtown that's probably rolling all over the floor right this minute." "I never wanted to be an onion," Harriet said from the floor. "And it's a good thing. How many parts do you think are written for onions these days?" Mr. Welsh laughed. "I don't imagine you did want to be an onion. For that matter, who knows if an onion does either?" Mrs. Welsh laughed up at him. "You're so smart. Let's see you fall like an onion." "Don't mind if I do," said Mr. Welsh, and putting down his pipe, he fell solidly to the floor. The floor shook. "Honey, did you hurt yourself?" Mr. Welsh just lay there flat. "No," he said quietly, "but it's not as easy as it looks." He lay there breathing. Harriet took another fall just to keep him company. "Why don't you get up, honey?" Mrs. Welsh stood over him with a worried look on her face. "I'm trying to feel like an onion. The closest I can get is a scallion." Harriet tried to feel like an onion. She found herself screwing her eyes up tight, wrapping her arms around her body, and then buckling her knees and rolling to the ground. "My God, Harriet, are you sick?" Mrs. Welsh rushed over to her. Harriet rolled around and around the room. It wasn't bad at all, this being an onion. She bumped into her father, who started to laugh. She couldn't keep her face screwed up and laughed at him. Her father started being an onion in earnest, rolling and rolling. Harriet suddenly jumped up and started to write in her notebook. "I wonder what it would be like to be a table, or a chair, or a bathtub, or another person. I wonder what old Golly would say to that. Old Golly looked like a bird with teeth, but I think I really look like an onion. I wish she would come back." Harriet was so absorbed in her writing that she had forgotten that her parents were in the room. When she finally slammed her book and looked up, they were staring at her in the strangest way. "What were you doing, dear?" asked Mrs. Welsh in an ever so casual way. "Writing in my notebook?" Harriet began to feel nervous. They were looking at her in such a strange way. "Oh, can we see?" "No!" Harriet almost screamed, and then said more quietly, "Of course not. It's secrets." "Oh," said her father, and looked rather hurt. What is the matter with them? Harriet thought. They both just kept looking at her. "Is it something for school, dear?" asked Mrs. Welsh. "No," said Harriet, and felt even more nervous. Why didn't they stop looking at her? "I'm sort of tired, honey. I think I'll go to bed," Mrs. Welsh said to her husband. "Yeah, me too," he said, taking up his pipe. Why are they acting like that? Thought Harriet. You'd think I was doing something very funny. Old Golly never acted like that. Her parents kissed her goodnight in a rather melancholy way and went out. She reached for her notebook and was starting to write when she heard her father say, sotto voce, on the steps, "Yes, it makes me feel I don't even know my own child." And Mr. Welsh answered, "We must try to know her better now that Miss Golly is gone." Harriet felt puzzled. She wrote, "Why don't they say what they feel? Old Golly said, always say exactly what you feel. People are hurt more by misunderstanding than anything else." Am I hurt? I don't feel hurt. I just feel funny all over. And by the time she went to sleep, she felt even funnier. The next day, she felt very grumpy again on the way to school. Sport and Janie came running up to her as she was going in and told her that they planned to practice their dances that afternoon, and did she want to practice with them at Janie's house. She said yes in such a grumpy way that they stared at her. Then, when she breathed in a very labored way and said, "Don't mind me," they really stared. She went on into school, calling back over her shoulder, "I'll be there after my spy route." They just looked at her. That afternoon, she decided to try Mrs. Plummer again, even though she knew it was terribly risky. She waited for the maid to leave the kitchen and then darted into the dumbwaiter, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard. She pulled the ropes gingerly. They worked smoothly at first, but just as she reached the parlor floor, there was a terribly loud creak. She sat there horrified, not daring to breathe. Then she heard voices. Impossible! Impossible! Mrs. Plummer's voice came out of a pile of pillows, in a whisper filled with horror. Nadine! Mrs. Plummer screamed to the maid. Nadine! A chilling scream fading at the end. Yes, ma'am? Harriet could see the maid standing primly to one side of the bed. Mrs. Plummer raised up, looking like a bloated eagle. Nadine! It can't be! It can't be! And flopped back down, disappearing into pink pillows. Doctor's orders, ma'am. From the pillows, confined to bed, and the tiny voice was lost for a minute. For the rest of my life. And a wail rose. Well, thought Harriet, feeling agitated and strangely in sympathy with Mrs. Plummer. She did want to be there. She moved a little to write in her book. Is old Golly right? Is it terrible to get what you want? I want to be a writer, and I'll be finked if I'll be unhappy when I am. Some people just don't think things out. At that moment, there was a querulous shout from Mrs. Plummer. What? What was that? Harriet looked through her peephole and saw both faces staring right at her. Her mouth opened in speechless terror. They had seen her. She felt everything stop, as in a photograph. There's nothing, ma'am. But of course, they couldn't have seen her. They couldn't see through walls. There's something in there. I heard it scratching, like a mouse or a rat. Oh, I don't think so. Nadine marched firmly to the dumbwaiter and pulled up the door. She jumped and yelled wildly when she saw Harriet. Harriet started pulling on the ropes, but Nadine recovered herself and stopped the dumbwaiter as it started to move. Come out of there, you, she said harshly, and pulled Harriet out. Harriet flew through the air on Nadine's arms and landed in a pile at her feet. What is that? Mrs. Plummer shrieked. A child, ma'am, said Nadine, holding Harriet by the hood of her sweatshirt. Out! Out! Get it out of here! That's all! All I need! As she fell back into the pillows, Nadine hoisted Harriet into the air and swung her out the door and down the steps. Even though her feet were dangling helplessly, her mind was racing with fear. Harriet took a few mental notes of the interiors as they descended. There, said Nadine, pushing her out the door. Good riddance, and don't get caught again in there. Harriet looked back. Nadine winked at her. Feeling ridiculous, she started to run. She didn't stop running until she was at her front door. She sat down on the stoop and panted a long time. That's the first time in 3 years of spying that I've been caught, she thought. After she got her breath back, she opened up her notebook. Spies should not get caught, and she underlined the should not get caught. That is the one essential thing about spies. I am a rotten spy. Of course, how was I to know that she was going to do that? But that's no excuse. I just knew it was too dangerous to go there. She sat looking dejectedly at the park. As she stared at the black trees, one tear rolled down her cheek, and she wrote, Old Golly would have had something to say about this, and also about that onion business last night. She slammed her book, and suddenly, terribly grumpy, she decided to go over to Janie's house to practice, even though she had no desire now to roll around on the floor. I'll stop there in the middle of chapter 8. She got caught. Do you think Nadine knew that she was there the whole time? Because it almost seemed like she was trying not to open that door in front of Mrs. Plummer. And then she winked at Harriet at the end when she said, "You better not be caught there again." But she didn't say, "You better not go in there again." What do you think? Did Nadine the maid know that she was in that dumbwaiter? See if you can make up a dance as an onion. What would it look like? I wonder, an onion that's rolling around on the floor. It does seem like it's pretty hard. But we'll find out what happens in the rest of chapter 8 in the next video.